So I'm going to talk about ethnic American literature, Toni Morrison, and Oprah Winfrey. And I hope I'll be able to tie these three things together and make a connection between them. In the first part of my lecture, I'm going to discuss the democratic impulse of, can you hear me?
Yes.
Of ethnic American literature and the position of ethnic literature in the broader category of American literature. In the second part of my lecture, I will examine the key role that the multimedia star, Oprah Winfrey, has played in popularizing the work of ethnic American writers, particularly Toni Morrison, to a wide audience through her very popular book club. When I speak about ethnic American literature, I am referring to the literary productions of a variety of religious, racial, national, and cultural groups. Some examples include Native American literature, which is, of course, the first ethnic American literature, African American literature, Asian American literature, Hispanic American literature, Slovenian American literature. The list of ethnic American literatures goes on and on. As many types of ethnic American literatures as there are types of ethnic Americans. If we consider the body of American literature as a sort of community, then the democratic principles of social equality and respect for the individual within that community are vitally important. One of the preeminent scholars of Chinese American literature, Amy Ling, makes this point eloquently in her essay, Whose America Is It? She writes, multicultural literature is the affirmation of the most fundamental principle of a democracy, to give all people an equal voice. The legacy of the civil rights movement and the women's movements is simply the recognition that no single perspective can express the human condition or take a universal stance. Rather, we each have our own particular histories, our own individual perspectives, and all of these, different as they may be, express the human condition in all of its complexity. Each voice is valid and valuable. And the more open we are to listening to these diverse voices, the more enriched and enlarged our own lives will be. And that's the end of the quote from Amy Ling. What I find most interesting about Amy Ling's comment is the connection that she makes between democracy and multicultural literature. The principle of allowing each individual, regardless of gender or racial, ethnic, religious, or economic background, an equal voice. Moreover, she points out that this respect for the minority should not be viewed as a threat to the majority. Instead, it is in the interest of the majority to listen to diverse voices, for those voices enrich everyone in society. Ethnic American literatures are now usually included as part of the American literary canon. And when I say canon, I'm using the word spelled C-A-N-O-N, which in literature refers to the body of work that is deemed to be great, classic, enduring. Okay? Works by ethnic American writers are now taught in universities, included in influential anthologies, prominently displayed in bookstores, and found on the lists of major book awards. It was, however, not always that way, and disagreement over the ethnic diversity of American literature still remains. The question of how and why certain literary works have been included in American university curricula, published in anthologies, and considered classics has long been debated. One of the primary reasons for this investigation is the fact that certain kinds of literature, that written by women, people of color, and non-Anglo ethnicities, for example, had been excluded, kept out of the canon. The challenge of including these neglected works is an issue that is vital to literary studies in the United States. I believe in the truth of this broad statement. The single most important development in American literature over the last 7 decades has been the transformation of the canon to include women and writers of diverse racial and ethnic heritage. To trace the origins of this canonical transformation, I'm going to summarize some information from the Heath introduction, the Heath Anthology of American Literature. I turn first to the 1950s, when educated American readers were expected to know the work of Ralph Waldo Emerson, Henry David Thoreau, Herman Melville, Nathaniel Hawthorne, Edgar Allan Poe, Walt Whitman, Mark Twain, Robert Frost, T.S. Eliot, Ernest Hemingway, William Faulkner, F. Scott Fitzgerald, and you're probably noticing that there's a connection between all of these writers, and that is that they're all white men. Emily Dickinson and Edith Wharton were sometimes approved of as worthy of attention, but the message was clear when it came to the roster of great American writers. Women, people of color, and of non-Anglo ethnic backgrounds were excluded. It was not a coincidence that the cultural elite, the cultural arbiters, critics, university professors, publishers, and editors who created this white male literary canon were themselves white males. The tastes and values of this influential group were reflected in canonical American literature into the early 1960s. But other alternative voices were struggling to be heard. These writers began to make themselves known by the middle of the decade. The first challenge to the composition of the traditional literary canon came primarily from African American authors, most of whom were male. As the struggle for African American civil rights progressed in the 1960s, books written by African Americans were being taught in American universities for the first time. The 1970s brought further erosion of white male dominance of the American literary canon. At this time, the challenge was put in terms of gender. As African Americans had done in the previous decade, women united to pursue their own interests in the feminist movement. Corresponding to the feminist critique of patriarchy in American society was a reappraisal of the canon and its gender bias. Owing to the efforts of feminist scholars, the work of many previously neglected or forgotten women writers was recovered. The work of contemporary women writers was taken more seriously, and women's studies programs were founded in American universities. The canon was still mostly white and male, but by the end of the 1970s, African Americans and women were succeeding to some degree in taking their rightful place beside the Emersons, or next to the Emersons, Hemingways, and Fitzgeralds. The 1980s brought a rise of interest in African-American women writers. Toni Morrison, Maya Angelou, and Alice Walker were but a few of those who wrote best-selling books. Works by Asian American, Hispanic American, Native American, and other ethnically identified writers began to be displayed prominently on bookstore shelves, to appear more frequently in university classes, and to be analyzed in literary journals. Gay and lesbian studies, too, were recognized as legitimate academic fields for the first time, and a canon of homosexual writers began to take shape. To summarize, as the 20th century drew to a close, the white male literary canon was in the process of being deconstructed to include a more diverse group of writers. This deconstruction did not go unchallenged, however, as the movement to open the literary canon was met by a backlash from some conservative cultural critics who argued that inferior writers were being lauded not for the high aesthetic quality of their work, but rather because of their gender or ethnicity. Thus, in an age when women and minority groups have fought for equal representation in many facets of society, their struggle for representation in the canon of American literature continues. Looking to the future, it is inevitable that multicultural literature will only grow and gain in prominence in the United States. If for no other reason, this will occur as a result of demographic changes in the American population. According to the US Census Bureau, their projection data, by the year 2025, white people will no longer be the majority group in the United States. Specifically, I predict a rise in Hispanic American literature, because this is the most rapidly expanding segment of the United States population. By the year 2050, it is expected that Hispanics will compose 25% of the overall population. So by 2050, a quarter of all Americans will be ethnically identified as Hispanic American. And publishers will surely want to reach this expanding market. What have ethnic American authors themselves had to say about their work and its position in the canon and the broader US culture today? I want to consider quotations from three writers, beginning with the Chinese-American novelist Ha Jin, who has stated that for him, multicultural literature is a source of vitality for American culture and for the English language. There have always been marginal forces that have broadened the mainstream throughout the history of American literature. They develop and flourish and enrich the literature and the language. Diversity is always a good thing. It's the source of life and the richness and abundance of a culture. What I find most interesting about Ha Jin's quotation is his assertion that multicultural voices not only enrich literary works, but also the language itself. He recognizes that English is, as it's used in the United States, a living language. It absorbs and is transformed by the different languages with which it comes into contact. It is constantly changing and being transformed in interesting ways. Second quotation. From a Lebanese-American poet, D.H. Melham, who writes, "Literature is part of culture. Culture is a meeting place. We must care where people come from in order to respect the fact that they have origins. They have parents and grandparents. They have music, dancing, poetry. There is great pleasure in diversity." What strikes me about Melham's comment is her assertion that there is great pleasure in diversity. I'm reminded of two culinary metaphors that have been used to describe American culture. One is that of the melting pot, a famous metaphor, which dates back many generations. The idea, as I'm sure you know, is that the immigrant comes to the U.S. and assimilates to American culture, leaving his or her culture and cultural customs and folkways behind to become American. That's the metaphor of the melting pot. There is another more recent metaphor, though, that is the metaphor of the multicultural stew. A stew is like a kind of soup, but it's one in which the individual ingredients retain some of their own flavors and textures and other characteristics. Combined together, they make a distinct dish, but they maintain some of their individuality. I believe Melham's view of multiculturalism is closer to this metaphor of the stew than to that of the melting pot. And the third and final quotation from Bharati Mukherjee. She writes, "My mission, if you will, is to get Americans to realize that we have to work together to redefine what American culture is and what the total heritage is. I can be just as much an American writer writing the kind of material that I do as Don DeLillo writing a novel about baseball. There are many Americans, and it's sensitizing people to accept us as part of the fabric." Mukherjee employs a different metaphor in this quotation, that of the multicultural piece of fabric, or perhaps a quilt. I admire her notion of majority and minority groups being woven into a single piece. The strength of that fabric, then, comes from the quality of the weaving, how strongly knit together they are. Again, one does not have to become the other, but rather the two engage in a kind of collaborative project. As she writes, they must work together to redefine what American culture is and what the total heritage is. Okay, so I'm now going to narrow my focus and turn our attention to a major figure in U.S. popular culture and the role she has played in promoting the careers of ethnic American writers, in effect, creating her own popular literary canon. And I'm referring, of course, to the multimedia star Oprah Winfrey, her book club, and its influence on the career of the United States' most celebrated African-American author, the Nobel Prize winner, Toni Morrison. As you probably know, Oprah Winfrey first became famous as the host of her television talk show, which featured interviews with celebrities, discussions of social issues, and her book club. Begun in 1986, the Oprah Winfrey Show was the #1 rated talk show for 25 consecutive seasons. Winfrey is also an actress, television and film producer, and magazine publisher who owns her own television and radio networks. She is consistently ranked among the most admired women in the United States and widely recognized as one of the most powerful women in America, if not the world. She has received an honorary doctoral degree from Harvard University, and in 2013 was awarded the nation's highest civilian honor, the Presidential Medal of Freedom, by Barack Obama, for her meritorious contributions to the cultural life of the United States. Worth $2.9 billion, she is the world's richest entertainer, the richest African American of the 20th century, and the only African American billionaire. Given that she has amassed much of this fortune from attracting people to her television show, her sponsorship of a book club might seem ironic. Nevertheless, she is an avid reader and a self-professed lover of books. When Winfrey started Oprah's book club in September 1996, her stated intention was to help get this country reading again. That was her quote. During the club's 15-year existence, Winfrey selected a total of 70 books, almost all of which became immediate bestsellers as a result of her selecting them. This is what is known as the Oprah effect. When she selects your book for the club, it immediately becomes a bestseller. The original televised Oprah's Book Club was fashioned after a book discussion group of the kind that has become popular in the United States. In this model, a group of people chooses a particular book and then gathers together at a later date to discuss what they read. It is estimated that in 2014, more than 5 million Americans belong to book clubs of different kinds. The difference between these informal groups and Oprah's book club was that the latter's, Oprah's book club's, meetings were broadcast on her television show. The first version of Oprah's book club functioned this way. Winfrey announced her book choice, gave her audience time to read it, and then selected several club members who discussed the book with the author on Oprah's television show. Winfrey's book choices were and continue to be based on her own tastes and interests. She does not solicit new works from publishers, nor does she have a financial interest in the books she chooses. There can be little argument that Winfrey has emerged as one of the most influential arbiters of literary taste in the United States. The announcement of her book selection has become one of the most anticipated events in the publishing world. Books selected by Oprah's Book Club are guaranteed over 1 million sales as a result. Nonetheless, in early 2002, she announced that she was putting the club on hiatus. She was giving it a break because she felt its purpose had been fulfilled and a number of other similar clubs would continue its mission. A year later, the club resumed operation owing to requests from fans and Winfrey's persistent desire to promote her favorite books. This time, however, her selections were limited to older classic titles. Her first choice for the revived club was South African Alan Paton's 1948 novel, Cry, the Beloved Country. With Oprah's retirement from her nationally syndicated television show in 2011, so too was her book club retired. However, in June 2012, the club was relaunched as Oprah's Book Club 2.0. As you might gather from the 2.0 in its name, this new club focuses on digital media, including Facebook, Twitter, and e-readers. In its latest version, Winfrey's selections are announced on her website. She interviews the author on a special program televised on her Oprah Winfrey television network. Readers can post comments about the books on the website or Twitter, and can download digital copies of the books, which include Winfrey's notes and a reading group guide. Winfrey's first selection for the 2.0 book club was Cheryl Strayed's memoir, Wild. As the New York Times reported, after its selection by Winfrey in early June, Strayed's book reached #1 on the nonfiction bestseller list by July 15th and stayed there for many weeks. This confirmed that the Oprah effect of creating bestsellers still worked. She has since chosen a novel by Ayanna Mathis entitled The 12 Tribes of Hattie in 2013, and Sue Monk Kidd's novel The Invention of Wings earlier this year. Of the 3 selections for Oprah's Book Club 2.0, one is by an African American, Ayanna Mathis, and all 3 are by women. In her show business endeavors, Winfrey has demonstrated a desire to not only entertain, but also educate her audience. Her choices for her book club reflect her aesthetic and social interests, particularly her support of multicultural literature and education. Winfrey has made a point of introducing her fans to writers of diverse racial and ethnic backgrounds. These include African American, Asian American, Hispanic American, Jewish American, and Native American authors. She has been especially drawn to the work of African American Nobel Prize winner Toni Morrison, choosing 4 of her novels for her original book club, the televised book club, which was the largest number the largest number of selections for any single author. Winfrey has called Morrison the greatest living American writer, and Morrison has referred to Winfrey's book club as a revolution. When Morrison was awarded the Nobel Prize in 1993, it marked the first time that an African American writer had been so honored. Like Winfrey, Morrison is also a recipient of the Presidential Medal of Freedom, awarded in 2012. While she has published in multiple genres, it is upon her 10 novels that her reputation rests. The first novel, The Bluest Eye, was published in 1970. The most recent, Home, appeared in 2012. I'm going to pause here to show some illustrations. An early photo of Toni Morrison from her college yearbook. Toni Morrison with her son Slade. This was taken in the 1970s, I believe. She has since collaborated with Slade Morrison on several children's books. More pictures of Toni Morrison. Morrison receiving the Medal of Freedom from President Obama in 2012. And Oprah receiving the same medal the following year. Graffiti of Morrison in Spain. Postage stamp from Sweden, of course, where the Nobel Prize is awarded. I'll quickly go through the covers of the books. Dates of publication at the bottom. these are the stamps, the images that appear on the covers of the books that are selected for Oprah's Book Club. This was the first one on the left, and now the 2.0 on the right. Toni Morrison. As I mentioned, Oprah Winfrey is also an actress. Here, this is a scene from the film version of Beloved. Oprah Winfrey owns the film rights to all of Toni Morrison's works. In the United States, Morrison's work is not only favored by critics, but also widely read. This is no small achievement for an author whose formally complex fiction addresses difficult issues of race, gender, and class. What has saved Morrison from joining the ranks of critically acclaimed authors of serious fiction who have small readerships? She has offered a partial answer. Morrison said, "I always thought that the best art is the only thing that would attract the largest number of people. The more complex it is, the more resonant it is. That's when the audience is wider, not when you dumb it down." Another reason for her popular success is Oprah Winfrey, who selected the following Morrison novels for her book club: Song of Solomon, Paradise, The Bluest Eye, and Sula. Their selections by Winfrey brought them attention and sales. In Paradise, Winfrey endorsed what is arguably Morrison's most ambitious and difficult novel. The imprimatur, the stamp of Oprah's book club, undoubtedly accounted for considerable sales of Paradise to readers who otherwise would not have purchased such a daunting novel. Finally, Morrison's appearances on Oprah's television show have literally brought her image into the homes of millions of Americans. Morrison's novel Love was published in 2003. Among the shortest of Morrison's novels, it is typically complex and populated by a large cast of characters. The large majority of the United States reviews of the novel were laudatory, but Winfrey did not select it, presumably due to her book club's focus on established literary classics at that time. While they were not Oprah's book club selections, Morrison's last two novels, In Mercy, published in 2008, and Home, published in 2012, both received extensive publicity on Oprah's website, Facebook, and Twitter. In the nearly 80 years since their inception, commercial book clubs in the United States have proliferated and become more specialized. A recent internet search turned up no fewer than 127 clubs in 20 categories. In the last 2 decades, electronic media and online reading groups have transformed the very concept of the Through the Mail book club established by the Book of the Month Club in 1926. That was the very first American book club. Oprah's book club and other book clubs like it are positioned at the intersection of American culture and commerce. They are at once commercial enterprises and cultural institutions which can exert significant influence on authors and the reading public. In a small but nonetheless significant way, they can help bind together a multicultural nation by asking its citizens to read the same book together and share their views about it. The role that Oprah's book club has played in the career of Toni Morrison underscores a number of cultural issues. Among the most important is the function of cultural intermediary in presenting the work of an ethnic American author to an audience that might not otherwise be inclined to read her work. At the same time, I do not underestimate the democratizing effect of the internet, which allows ordinary readers now to post their own reviews and thereby influence other readers. As Daniel Mendelsohn wrote in the New York Times book review earlier this year, quote, "Today, audiences as well as critics play a lively role in establishing which works get discussed, analyzed, and noticed. Nonetheless, the central place of Oprah's book club in the marketplace of American book-buying dollars and ideas is undeniable, as is her ability to bring previously marginalized or underappreciated ethnic American writers to the attention of the American public." And so that's the end of my formal lecture, but I want to take a moment to acknowledge a great American writer who died last week, Maya Angelou. Maya Angelou is the author of many volumes of poetry and autobiography, including a classic memoir, I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings. She also wrote a poem called On the Pulse of the Morning, which was selected. President Clinton invited her to read that poem at his second inauguration. She was also, as you can see, a close friend of Oprah Winfrey's. Winfrey chose Maya Angelou's second volume of autobiography, The Heart of a Woman, for her book club in 1997. She was also, among these, Oprah Winfrey, Toni Morrison, like those two, she was a recipient of the Presidential Medal of Freedom. She received the award in 2010. She was truly a great American writer, and it was quite a loss last week, when she died last week.